There should be a plot configuration folder that has Digitech 2018 and Digitech 2018 small and large, basically. They're called, it's a .ctb file. That's just an interface for what CAD understands. But let's just go ahead and download both of those if you haven't already. So it should be in the class references folder. There should be a subfolder in there called plot configurations. Okay. I'm just going to extract those to my downloads. Go back to CAD. So when I search for my plot styles, I want to make sure that where CAD is looking for the plot styles when I open up my print dialog menu is there's a preset spot for it to be for us to locate these plot styles. So what I want to do is copy these into that folder, and where that folder is located should be, if we go to our file menu, we go to I believe in print and manage plot styles. Yeah, that should bring up where these other plot styles are located. So basically, it's just like, no, that's fine. So in File, in Print, and then Manage Plot Styles, that's just basically opening up the location folder for these default. So what I actually want to do is I want to just copy in wherever I downloaded it from online. So in this particular case, I just downloaded it to my downloads file or downloads folder. So I'm just going to copy those over into the plot styles, plotter plot styles folder. So they should show up. There's other CTB and STB files there. All right, so now, is everybody following that location? Copied in those large and small Digitech CTBs.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah.
I was confused with the recording.
Oh yeah, that's just my screen recorder showing the screen. Ignore that.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to close this now, or just in case it doesn't work, I'll minimize it. We'll close this. So we're back in CAD. Now, if I go to the plotter, notice that my Digitech is there, right? So, and also the small one now is located there. So it worked. Great. All right, so with the Digitech 2018 large version selected as our plot style, let's, I think everyone's plot default setup from this file should be tabloid, Adobe PDF, plot layout, make sure that it's a portrait orientation. It should just look like the screen looks like right now. Okay, so if I click preview, what this has done is it's converted the line weights that were different colors now into different weighted lines. It's pretty clean. That's good. So this just save me time later when I'm in another program when I'm post-processing. It's just one less step of things that I have to do, converting all the colored lines to black and white. So my print preview looks good, so I'm going to click plot. Yeah.
At some point, are we going to learn how to create our own?
Learn how to create your own plot style. So we can. What I had done is I set up that Digitech 2018 plot style kind of knowing where you guys were going to be going in Studio in terms of the scale you'd be working at. That plot style should work pretty well for your Studio-related work. We can certainly talk about how to set up your own personal plot style at some point. I think it would take a little too long to do in class right now, but I can either link you to a video that's already made of someone else explaining it well, or I'll show it to you, but after class. But yeah, if that doesn't interest you, or that seems like a daunting task, the whole point of those Digitech default styles that I put into the reference folder is for everyone's use. It should generally let your drawings look legible at the scales that you'll be drawing in. Okay. So I'm just going to make a folder on my desktop just called Site Plans for now. You can do this in your Dropbox if you want to, or on the desktop and then copy it in later. It's fine. We're just going to call this what the name of the tab is, Site Plan 1 to 2500. Save. It should be as a PDF. And then basically we should get this as our export for that, right? And I just did a zoom to page level to see the whole page. So I'm going to close that for now. I don't need that at the moment. I'm going to just do this very quickly for the other two, just using the same plot style, the same setup. I'm going to preview it. It's at a slightly larger scale. Looks pretty good. We'll click plot, save it to the same location, 1 to 1250. And then we'll do the same for the last one. Okay. Just preview it just in case. Always good to do a plot preview, just in case something is not right that you don't see when the colored preview is showing up. Okay. Okay, so we have our 3 different scaled site plans. Now, we're going to go, I'm just going to make sure that RHINO is closed here. Don't need that. Okay, close this as well. All right, so let's open up Illustrator. So it's just a reminder to me, a few of you have opened up Illustrator, tooled around in it, or used it for a studio, in support of studio assignment to this point. It's been, you've had to, right? And yeah, all right. Prior to being forced to opening it, did anyone have experience using Illustrator previously? A little bit. Okay. All right, good. Well, so we just for the sake of everyone being on the same page, since we have not yet officially covered Illustrator in this class, I'm just going to briefly run through some of the useful command lines and the kind of just the interface real quick if anybody's unfamiliar with it. So let's go ahead and just open up along the top here in File. Let's open up a drawing. Control-O also shortcuts to that. Let's navigate to wherever you saved your export PDFs. And let's open up the 1 to 2500 plan. So it should come in like this. And you'll also notice, if you haven't yet opened up Illustrator, Illustrator does a better job rendering out line work than CAD does. So sometimes CAD can be a little deceptive because it flattens everything, even if it does have line weights attached to it. And it doesn't give you the impression of how the drawing is going to actually look when it's printed. Illustrator does a better job of that. Truly, and I said this in class 1, I think, like, you should try to do test plots of your work at various intervals throughout to understand, again, line weight, legibility, size of text, just how something's reading on a wall. Pin it up and walk across the room and look at it from afar, from a distance, from the distance that a reviewer might be sitting in a chair looking at it. Those types of things, the medium and the intended viewer and the environment that they're going to be in is all important to the success of how you're conveying your work. So so this looks pretty good though. So I think we have a couple things that we can look at here. Along the top, there is a kind of an ever-changing menu bar that will have different readouts for different variables in the scene depending on what either command you're in or what the drawing information on the page looks like. So right now, there's some information about line thickness. The stroke weight is associated with how thick a line is. There's also a document setup button. Presumably there would be a document setup button on the top of your screens. Do all of your work interfaces look similar to this? Okay. Sometimes these are in different places. Just very quickly, if you were to ever find yourself disoriented in Illustrator, or you're on another computer and it has different presets or something like that, or you're working with an older version or something like that, you can usually, let's just like move some things around here just to, or say I close like my layer menu here. Oh my gosh, where has it gone? I can go to Window, and I can do a couple things. Window has all of the menus, all of the master menus that are available for you in Illustrator in one list. Within these lists, there are sub-lists of menus that are associated with these little toolbars, but any toolbar that you'd see in this scene, you should be able to pull up from this list here. So in our case, layers, I can find the layers button and bring that back, and it's brought me my layer button back. And then I can just dock that by left-click dragging it with the little dotted line at the top if I wanted to. Let's say that, like I had just done here, I've moved all these different toolbars around, and it's a messy workspace, and I want to get it back to like the default setting that I had when I opened it up in terms of what menus were where, what particular submenus were open, and I don't want to have to go through and open up each individual one. You can go to your workspace window in the window menu, and there's a few different presets that Illustrator has basically put together in anticipation of these different types of workflows. So they're not always perfect, but they do support, like, okay, let's say I'm doing something that's more related to graphics or typography or tracing maybe. This will, if I click on this, it will bring up menus that it thinks should be relevantly associated with that layout. So let's click tracing just to see. So basically it brings up a navigator menu, which is like a little mini viewport of the much larger drawing. So what's useful about this is, let's say I zoom in to a portion of this, but it's a very big drawing. It will show me a preview of the overall drawing and what sector of that drawing I'm in. The image trace is a powerful command that we can talk about. It is rife with glitches and risk, but we can talk about it, and we can talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of it. A couple other things that you'll notice here that the screen kind of reoriented to when I clicked trace as the preset was my line weight menu, my stroke menu. That's still there. That was in the other menu. We'll talk about these in more detail as we start to draw a little bit more. But in this menu, under stroke, I can adjust line thickness in the scene. I can change how lines meet one another. Say you have two lines that well, I can show you. I'm just zooming in, holding the Alt key, and using my mouse scroll. That allows me, while I'm holding Alt, to zoom in and out. I'm panning by holding down spacebar and left-clicking. I could, just very quickly, I could reset the sort of zoom on my scene. I believe if I type Control-0, that will zoom me out to the full extent of the document. So if you're ever lost, or you're way zoomed in or way zoomed out, Control-0 lets me just recalibrate. It's like the zoom extents button in CAD and in RHINO. So with stroke, like I can click, I'm left-clicking on this one object here. Another thing that's nice about Illustrator is it's smart enough to understand the type of work that you did in RHINO or in CAD that maybe isn't immediately present when you first look at one of these drawings. Like if I joined lines in CAD, it will bring those objects into Illustrator as a joined object, which is nice if you want to, say, shade this object or add color to it, or change all the line weights of the perimeter rather than having to go through each individual line. So it's smart in that it works well with these other drafting programs. So let's say I have this selected. You'll notice that on the stroke menu, it's saying that the line weight of this particular perimeter is 0.78 points. That's fine. That's neither here nor there. If we type in 1 in that area, it'll thicken this line up. You can see the slight thickening of it. I could type in 5 or 10, and it will get even bigger. But for now, let's just keep it at 0.78. So another thing you'll notice is that the cap, which is how the lines meet one another at a corner, is currently in the round cap mode. So what that means is if I were to zoom in on a corner here, you can see there's a little filleted edge to that line. And this may not seem relevant or particularly interesting at a scale that's this zoomed out, where we're only seeing these bigger shapes. But when your line weights get thick enough, and your drawing gets detailed enough, how that line edge reads, especially after you've printed something and it's on a wall, can go a long way towards the legibility of your drawing just being that extra layer of refined. So let's say that I were to change the cap to butt cap what that actually, in the case of a closed shape, that we're not going to see a difference here. But in the case of, actually, let's say corner. So miter joint should change this to square. So you can see the square joint has been changed. Or I could chamfer the corner. So there's again, at some scales, this stuff will be less, you won't ever touch this stuff. As you zoom in on buildings more, or if you're drawing diagrams that are a little bit more abstract from like a faithfully drawn plan, how the line weights, how the graphic design of that diagram reads, is these kinds of things will become important. Another thing that you can do that you might notice is that by default, all lines in Illustrator are drawn, calibrated through their center point, basically. So you see the blue line is how Illustrator's understanding the extent of this shape. So if I were to draw a new shape, say I drew a rectangle with the rectangle tool on the left, just left click and drag and then release to draw the rectangle. You'll notice that that line by default is at the center. I could also have that line be justified to the inside or to the outside of that. So in this particular case, that's not immediately relevant to our drawing exercise today, but sometimes maybe you have a sequence of shapes that you want to be slightly offset from one another in the scene, and you don't want those lines to overlap. You can use these different toggles for the alignments to still make the shapes connect to one another with the guides, but the lines themselves will read separate. There's all the subtleties of rounded edges, mitered edges, aligned strokes will, I think as you guys get more used to the program, the relevance of some of those things will come out. I could also, if I wanted to, I could dash this line. So say there's a solid line right now, but there's a whole dash line menu. I click dash line, and it actually makes this a dash line box that I can adjust the particular dashing of by changing this from 12 point is the default to, I can change it to 3 point. It makes it smaller. I could make it 50 point, and it's barely going to show up because it's so large. It actually doesn't even look like it's dashed. So 3 point is a good example here. Another thing you'll notice is that now it's still treating, the box is still an uninterrupted set of 4 lines that just happens to be represented in this drawing as separate dotted lines. But if I were to move this around, it's not several separate shapes. It's just a filter basically showing you that it's a dotted line. So why that's nice is if this was all separate dotted lines, those would each be their own individual pieces of geometry, right? And that starts to get a little bit tedious, a little bit harder to control if you wanted to make all those dotted lines change weight or color or something like that. Like you have to make sure that you're selecting all of them, and it can just be messy. When you export from CAD, within the Digitech plot style, within many plot styles, there's a dotted line layer that exists that is meant to represent hidden objects in your scene or objects that might be above or below you, based on some of the planning conventions that we've talked about previously. If you export a CAD file with that layer turned on, it will bring in the geometry as separate objects in Illustrator. So there's give and takes here between the level of detail that you're drawing in CAD, what you're adding in Illustrator. Just, again, things to be mindful of as you get more used to the interfaces of all these things. But for the sake of right now, I often find that dotted line drawing is easier to do in Illustrator, and so a provision to do from CAD is to just have a layer that you know is going to be dotted, but let it print as solid, and then you can make it a dotted line once you're in Illustrator. So just like with the solid line weight, if I wanted to, I can adjust the thickness of these lines, and obviously something like that it's so thick, I can make it even smaller. I can make it really, really, really thin. Another thing to consider here is from a printer tolerance standpoint and a legibility on a printed sheet of paper, anything below like 0.15 or 0.1 is not even going to really print on a normal 11x17 printer or even on a good plotter. That is such a fine line weight that it's not going to be legible. So I would try to very quickly get yourselves comfortable with the printing outputs of the Illustrator line weights that you're working with, or the CAD line weights. you noticed like one of our thickest lines coming in from CAD was the perimeter line, that yellow line that was in CAD. That's 0.78. So in this particular case, that line is going to be the thickest line that reads in the whole drawing. And then other lines in the drawing, like this one, for example, that's probably starting to be on the lower end of weight that we want, that will still read nicely. We could probably, like I said, we could take it down to 0.1 maybe. But in that realm of kind of 0.1 to 0.3, that's detail work or work that's inside of a larger bounding box. Again, not primary kind of weight that you want to read. Line weights between like 0.75 and up above 1 for many drawings. Those will be thick enough to read kind of the cut line or the edge of like a wall that you're cutting through, or the perimeter of a building or something like that. So there's obviously, exceptions to that rule in every situation, but that's just a good baseline. If you're working in, for the sake of the types of drawings and scales of drawings that we're working at, between about 0.1 to a little over 1 point is a good range for your printouts, unless you really want to emphasize something. Question?
When you plotted, it didn't save your layers, did it? Like when you opened it in Illustrator?
It did not. It did not. So in this case, it all came in as one. There's a couple ways that we could. I believe CAD will let you plot it with layers still intact. RHINO will as well. So another way that you can do this, if you say you found yourself working in a drawing, you've done some things to it already, you've realized I've forgotten to export those layers, you don't want to go back and re-export, you can use a series of filters in Illustrator to start to organize the line work back into layers that make sense for you. Also, once you're in Illustrator, the amount of useful layers oftentimes diminishes, right? So like in CAD, sometimes it's going to be more useful to say, all right, I have my interior wall layer, I have my exterior wall layer, I have my furniture layer, I have this, I have that. In Illustrator, it may end up being I have my light gray interior layer, I have my cut line layer, I have my landscape layer. It might translate to be simpler. So one way to kind of reorganize the drawing, if you only have one layer here, is I'm just going to pull my layer menu up here. Also, let me just really quickly revert to the essential workspace so that let's all go back to the essential workspace here. So essentials is, what it implies. It's the kind of basic, still has the same toolbar on the left, and many of the same ones on the right as we had in our tracing exercise. But it has a few other appearance related, color wheel related, transparency related menus that are useful generally in an architectural drawing exercise. So we're back to our essentials. If you have anything floating, like I said, you can dock it by just dragging it over and a blue line will appear, and then it will let it dock to the corners. So let's open up our layers menu here, the little hamburger, and I want to add, let's say I add a layer that says cut line. I add a layer that says details or something, and then maybe a layer that says landscape. And I'm just creating the layer from that little paper, create new layer in the corner. I can delete a layer by selecting it and just hitting the trash can button. Control Z undoes things. In Illustrator, you don't have to do a special undo to go back through multiple commands. You can just always type Control Z. In some of the other programs, you need to do like Control Alt Z or toggle it to override more than the immediately previous command that you undid. Illustrator just lets you do it, I think, up to 200 times as the default. So in case there was some catastrophic thing that you discovered that you needed to go back and fix, you can undo a good amount. So also redo, you can do Control Shift Z. So in this particular case, I had named these layers. I'm going to keep these as they are. So landscape, details, cut line. So now everything's on this one layer one right now. I can go and these two selection arrows do different things in the scene. The black selection arrow tends to be the arrow that it will select like a whole object if it's joined together. Notice all these objects are joined. It also selects objects and then creates like a larger bounding box around them. if I were to use the direct selection tool, the hotkey A with the white arrow, now if I select, I can select, it's selecting the whole object, but it's not adding that outline to it. Also, it's not immediately visible, but basically it will only operate on the portion of the line that I selected. So say I wanted to delete just that line. Since I just clicked on that edge, I can click delete, and it's only deleting that edge. Whereas if I'm with the black arrow and I click this shape and I click delete, it deletes the whole thing. So it's just it's a finer grained selection tool. So with the white arrow, with the direct selection arrow selected, I can go and say, all right, I want everything that has the same line weight as this box that I just selected. I want to move that to my cut line layer, let's say. So I can go up to Object, up to the Select menu, and then I can go to Same, and then there's different filters for what I can select with that same. So it generally is going to rely on you having something in the scene selected so that it understands what it's filtering against. This menu will appear gray if you don't have anything selected. Like if I don't have any objects selected and I go to Select, it will prompt me, but there's other things that I just can't select at all unless I have the right attribute selected, say for example. So I have that line selected, I go to Select Same, I go to Appearance. I could also say, in this particular case, I could say same stroke weight, because that's the specific filter that I want. Appearance is a slightly larger, a little bit more encompassing of a few different variables. Sometimes stroke weight won't work because, say you have a red line and a blue line that are both 1, right? But you only want to select the red line. Stroke weight will select everything that's 1 point. Appearance will actually say, okay, you are selecting a 1 point line and you only want to select the red line. That's fine. So appearance. So now, if I zoom out, everything in the scene that's a 1 point line I've been able to select. And now, while that's all selected, I can go over to my menu, my layer menu, and there's a little colored box that appears next to the layer that that artwork is selected in. So what I can do is I can left click this and hold down the left click and drag that to a new layer if I want to, and it will highlight the layer that it would go to with a color on the side here. So I can drag it to cut line. And so now what it's done is I still have line work on that base layer, right? All the other line work that's not that. But now I've moved all my 1 point or my 0.78 lines to the cut line layer. So now if I turn that layer off, you can see that all that stuff has been moved. And all the stuff on layer 1 is everything else. So I could, there's not many line weights in here. I could very quickly go through and say, all right, my 0.18 line weights, I want to select all those and move those to a details layer. Now that's good. I have my cut line. I'm just going to turn that stuff off so I understand what I've selected and what I haven't. Let's get rid of my dotted line box here. I have my looks like my landscape layer and my my trees layer here. Let's select same, see what that selects. I think there was some bad layer management on my end in CAD that I wasn't drawing all of these lines on the same layer, even though I wanted to. So say I had selected everything in the scene that I wanted to move, but then there's a few strays. I can hold down Shift, and with my direct selection tool, just add to the selection basically. So if I were to left click in the scene right now, it will deselect everything. I've lost that selection. But if I'm holding down Shift, I basically can add line weights or line work to the selection that so say I just wanted to do stuff to this object, I could select things by overall selection or add by holding down Shift and left clicking. So again, I'm going to go back to my filter. Yes, question?
Yeah, sorry, can you go to appearance again? You select a particular kind of line.
Yes.
You select, and you go to same appearance. Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah. So it's actually pretty, Illustrator is great. It's pretty intuitive. It's not as, I think RHINO is the most intuitive once you get the hang of it. But Illustrator is generally pretty straightforward in how it describes the different commands that you can use. So right, you go to select, we got same, appearance is one of them. There's obviously these other ones. Let's make sure those are all selected. I'm going to add a few strays like we had done. Now I'll move those to, let's actually make a new layer that's called Boulevard or something. Or misspelled Boulevard. Okay, turn that off. And then looks like there's still a few things that, again, maybe we're on the wrong layer in CAD. You can go back through and we could call this landscape, I guess. All this, no, that's okay.
How did you get them to the layer? What
So once you, so let's say we select this fountain here. And if I try to select that, with my direct select tool, you'll notice that it's actually made up of a sequence of smaller line segments that CAD was using. So that wasn't the most efficient way to select that. So I could do my select same appearance. It should select just that object. So now, if you're on the layer menu, you can see that there's artwork selected in color, and you should be able to left click that little colored box and hold, while you're holding the left click down, you can move that to another layer. So I'm holding the left clicker this whole time after I've highlighted the selected artwork. I'm just going to move it to the, I'll move it to the boulevard layer. And then the boulevard layer was turned off, so it hides it for me, which is just a nice way to visually filter what's going on really quickly. So now I'm seeing that, I have a few extra things here that looks like they were on I think that was the details of that rooftop. So I'm just going to move those to the details layer. Make this as well. Yes?
And how many different attributes are there that you can select layers by?
A good amount. So the main ones that you generally are going to find in a scene that you've drawn is line weight's a key one, color of the line is a key one, the fill of the object. So like say that I had a closed shape and the outline was black, but the inside I had filled it with green. I could select based on the fill. Also, I can select based on transparency. I can select based on, there's several other attributes that an object can gain that we can talk about that you can be specific about, but those are the main ones. Basically, line weight, line color, line fill, or shape fill. Those are easy ones.
Is it, and I'm just troubleshooting a little bit, are there times when Illustrator gets confused by which attribute you want?
Sometimes. So again, it will do as well as the information that you're able to give it. So if you have a messy file that only has everything on one layer, and you're trying to get again multiple colors of something onto one thing, you might have to go through a couple filters to do it. Generally, though, it will be good about. It's the line weight, line color, etc. It's very basic. It should understand that. Yeah. So again, the export out of CAD, export out of RHINO, and then once you're in Illustrator, kind of some initial just recalibration of layer organization is always just a good check. And frankly, it will save you hours of time deeper into the drawing if you just do it right away. Just make it a practice to either check that you've imported layers, redo some of the layers like we just did here. Let me see if we can export out of CAD with layers intact. So one way to export out of CAD with layers intact would be, let's see here. I know that there's a way to do it, and I'm going to take too long to find it here right now. Let's see. You know what? We'll loop back to it. If we were to do it out of RHINO, basically the make 2D export in RHINO is a slightly different command than you can plot out of RHINO as well, but it's just a less. It's not less intuitive. It's just I think the workflow is a little bit better in CAD for plotting. So I almost don't want to cover that this moment. If we have time at the end of class, we can troubleshoot that a little bit. You had a question?
Yeah, so like patchwork, would you preferably go with AutoCAD or?
It depends on what you're doing. Okay. So I like the flexibility of Illustrator. If you're gonna bring a drawing into Illustrator, Illustrator has some great hatches that you have more control over the scale of. if you hatch something in CAD, obviously once attached, it becomes an object. It becomes real geometry once you bring it into Illustrator. So say you had a series of dotted lines or something like that. All of that information will become their own separate objects in Illustrator. So sometimes, the simply plotting out of CAD, I think in school it's less less often that's going to be the case. You're going to need to filter it through another program to add whatever graphic you need to. In the field, sometimes you won't go through Illustrator at all. It might be it's a much more utilitarian. It might be straight out of CAD, and it's just simply about getting technical information to a contractor or something like that. In that case, then everything happens in CAD. I think for the sake of the kinds of drawings that you're going to want to make in school, the letting dotted lines and hatches and fills and things happen in the secondary program gives you more control. So we can see how that works. So for right now, we're just going to work with the layers that we created here. I'm just going to quickly move these tree shapes that I made to the landscape layer. Also, I noticed that this line, for whatever reason, wasn't the same as the line weight of the other trees. So if that's the case, if you find, again, it just came in on a different layer that I exported from CAD, I could match the properties of an adjacent shape by selecting the object and then going to the eyedropper tool, or clicking I. Once I click that once, left click it once, I can go over to a shape with the one that I've selected that I want to make a change to. I can click on the shape that I want to give that attributes over. And now if I deselect this, it's been made the same shape as that, or the same weight, just to further illustrate that point a little bit better. Let's say this is like a 3-point line, and I wanted to have just this line, this one, and this one be that same thing. So I can have that selection put together and then do the eyedropper tool, and then we'll just change those shapes. So again, you can just kind of quickly go through and kind of add in subtleties or changes. Say the base layer of landscape to represent all the trees, shapes, doesn't do justice to the fact that there's a denser grove of trees somewhere, or this particular tree you want to emphasize or highlight. That's a way that you could, within that layer, like change the weight or change the attribute. Okay, so our landscape layer there. I think this as well will just move to our boulevard layer. So we have everything off of layer 1. Basically, we have our boulevard, we have our cut line, which is basically our building outlines. It's almost better if we call it building outline. Okay. We got our details, and then we have our landscape. So, and we have our frame as well. So this is another thing to consider as you're thinking about the page and how things lay out. So the frame, it depends on the drawing layout that you're going for. It depends on what you're trying to show. Sometimes a frame is useful. We're looking in this case into a window of a much larger city plan. There's not a discrete edge to some of these buildings. If we were to remove the frame, we might run into some trouble as we're trying to hatch things or add color to things, because adding color, filling objects requires that those objects be closed. If you have an open-ended object, if I were to remove this frame, and you don't need to follow this part, but basically this now is an open shape. Say I wanted all the building, interiors to be gray, so that I understood the gray versus kind of maybe the white of the groundscape. I wouldn't be able to, at least initially, fill these objects because they have open edges. So the frame is going to let us work with like kind of a closed scene, and it's creating its own border. We can mess with, in fact, let's put this on its own layer just so that we can operate on it differently later. Frame, move that over there. All right, so that's off on. Let's put that at the bottom of our layer buildup. I'll delete my layer 1 here because there's nothing left on it. Just click the little trash can. Okay, so a couple things that we can do. You can, another thing about line weights, I guess. In Illustrator, you can make lines invisible, and again, it's a filter. So the line's not actually gone, it's just not visible to the eye. So you can use certain guides or this frame, for example. Say we actually decided we wanted there not to be a heavy box around the framework here. You could change the line work, certainly, to be something that's lighter, 0.1 or something like that. Or you could actually say 0, and this will make an invisible line that's still there and still acts as a boundary for the other shapes in my scene, but it just visually cleans it up. So obviously this can be, it's useful when you're trying to hatch things or add textures to things. It can be dangerous if you've lost track of where those lines are. So good to keep your invisible lines either as a separate set that you can always reference by, if I click the little circular button along any of the layer menus, it selects every object on that layer. Just left click there and it will select every object. So that's a quick way to select things as well. So let's say I wanted to select all the trees and I didn't want to go through and individually select these things or use my selection filter to do it. I could just click landscape, everything gets selected.
How do you get the double circle to go back to a single circle?
How do you get the double circle to go back to a single circle?
Yeah, so it's not selecting everything.
So,
Clicking through and it's got,
okay, so just click anywhere outside of your selection and it should let it unclick. Are you? Okay, so another aspect of kind of filtering here. Let me see. Let's do something to this scene to give it a little bit more legibility. So I made that frame line invisible. So I'm going to use something called Live Paint to add color to the scene. Live Paint is an awesome tool. It's really powerful. It's fun because it's visually easy to follow along with. It does have a few disadvantages though that we can walk through. So, all right. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate just my building outlines and my frame. So let's turn off Boulevard. Let's turn off Details and Landscape. So we just have these things in the scene, and it looks like I mentioned, there was a straggler here that was not supposed to be there. That we can move that to Landscape. That's fine. All right, so we have a sequence of our kind of building outlines here, or the major building components. Looks like this guy, see a doubled up line? So sometimes you'll notice too, this is just kind of a random troubleshooter. Just on the graphic interface here, I don't know if you can see it on our screen, but this box looks a little blacker than this box, a little darker. Everybody can see that? It's really slight. What that means is that there is doubled up line work there. This ultimately won't probably matter for a print once this prints. The quality of the printer is not going to necessarily pick that up. Sometimes though it does, and if there was accidentally, like say a copied object in the scene, those things will randomly read darker in kind of an unintentional way. So if you ever visually encounter that while you're working through Illustrator, you usually can find out pretty quickly. You can use your direct select tool, click, and then if I were to double click delete, I deleted a shape and there's still a shape under it. So, and now it looks like those lines read a little bit more close to one another. So another thing I want to do really quickly here is, I don't want to forget my poor little Barcelona pavilion. Let's actually put that on its own layer and hide it. So select those objects. Let's make a pavilion. We'll move those up there, and then we'll just turn it off. All right. So we have our building outlines. We have our frame. Our frame is invisible. Our frame is, I think, for the sake of what we're going to be doing, let's make him a weight again so we can see what's going on. So let's make it 0.25, just so that we can see it. So you can see that every object in this scene has the ability to be closed, including the field that's around the shapes, right? Everything has a closed edge, if we're thinking of the frame. Okay, so.
How do you, I don't know how I did this massive graph cube in the middle.
Okay, so there's a perspective grid tool on the left in the middle of the menu, which frankly I find incredibly annoying. It more often than not is just a nuisance, and you're going to be drawing in 3D in other things anyway, so it's rare that you would use this tool. When you click this tool, this is probably what's up on your screen. So what you have to do is actually go to the little X in the colored box, and it should make it go away.
It's like frozen on there or something.
So what it does when you're in that command is it doesn't let you toggle between any other commands. So you got to find your way to that little box, click X, and then get as far away from that icon as you can. Okay, so however, conveniently, right next to that button is the live paint bucket, which is what I want us to use. So if you hold down the left click over most of these buttons, you'll see the little pull down menu on these that bring up all these other options, right? Under the shape builder tool, there's a live paint bucket as the second option. Let's click that. And then what we want to do is actually select. So right now it's giving me, it shows me a little paint bucket. It shows me what you should see 3 boxes that have a null set in them. There's no color. There's no color in that in the colored boxes because we haven't chosen anything yet. There's also a little cross out over the paint bucket because it's basically saying, all right, you want me to fill something with color, but you haven't given me a selection. So actually, let's exit out of that paint bucket selection real quick. Let's select everything on our screen, including the frame, and then let's click paint bucket. So now what you can see is it's saying as you hover over the selection, it kind of highlights it, and it says click to make a live paint group. So I'm going to click left click. So now it's highlighting each of these objects in kind of a red highlighted way. Every closed shape that's in the live paint bucket selection is able to be operated on. So now I can exit out of this just for a second. So what you're going to notice is one disadvantage of live paint bucket is it takes every object that you've selected and it puts it all on the same layer. So notice that before I had moved my frame line work to a frame layer. Because I added that as a selection within live paint bucket, it actually moved it to the building outline layer. So that's fine for what we're doing right now, but what you'll want to do as you use live paint bucket in the future is just be very discreet and organized about the line work that you're going to do this to. Have it be on its own layer, have it be separate and toggleable so that you don't lose your layer organization from some of the base work. So a couple ways that you can do that is either have everything that's going to be a live paint bucket be on the layer that you want it to be on, or you can actually do, depending on how dense the line work is in your scene, you could copy that information and have that information live on its own layer and make all those lines invisible so that it's just about the color fill. And I can show you guys how to do that. So right now, though, we have everything. It's fine that frame moved to the next layer for a second. We'll just to illustrate the point here. What you'll also notice is when I'm selecting with the V selection tool, now everything is kind of grouped together. I can still work on separate components of the live paint bucket scene if I use my direct selection tool, the white arrow. I can still select separate objects, but it's a little less. I have a little less ability to navigate fully once I've made the live paint bucket selection. So this is another supporting idea for actually separating it out onto its own layer so that you can still change line work as you need to. Say I wanted to go back in here and change the line work of all these buildings or 3 of these buildings. With the live paint bucket selected, I'd have to go through a couple more steps to get there. I could double click on the group and it will bring me into the scene. You can see now we're inside of like a sub-menu here. There's this highlighted live paint sub-menu here. That's basically saying, okay, you're inside of just the live paint bucket selection. You can change objects in here as you want to, and then you can exit out of the selection and it will have made those changes. So let's say that we want to select these 3 buildings. Notice that I'm able to use my black arrow now that I'm inside of the paint bucket selection. I could go over and I could change the weight of these. I can basically run other commands while I'm in it. What you might notice though while you're in this selection, some of the selection tools above are diminished. So for example, I'm unable to select same while I'm inside of the live paint bucket selection because it's treating it from a global standpoint. It's treating it as one object at its like highest level. So, like I say, I think make sure that your kind of workflow is ordered properly. Like if you're going to change line weights, you're going to tweak things, try to have that either happen before you do the live paint bucket, or again, have some of these objects be on a separate layer. So I'm going to exit out. I'm going to undo those line weight changes that I made, and I'm just going to, I could either double click anywhere that's not in the selection, or I can click back one level, which will bring me back up to my the main scene that I was in. If I just double click outside of it, it also should exit out of that. So I can illustrate this point a little bit better. Say if I had my landscape layer turned on, I went into my live paint layer and double clicked it. Notice that the landscape layer actually got lighter, and I can't select the landscape layer because it's just letting me work in the live paint layer. Also in my layers menu, you'll notice that it's basically taking me into like an isolation mode. It's kind of like what we were doing in RHINO and in CAD, where you can freeze an object or you can hide an object temporarily to work on a specific object. This is just another visual way that it's as if we've hidden all the other objects, and they happen to be filtered in such a way that you can still see them. They're just lighter. They're in the background of the scene, so you can still see where they are. But you can only work on the objects that are in the isolation mode. So like I said, I'm just going to double click outside of that, so we're back at our regular layers menu. That's kind of a complex like umbrella of tasks there. Does everybody follow at least the logic behind that? I think like in practice, you're going to probably do a little trial and error to really get comfortable with it. But the idea that there's like nested sequences of information that you can specifically operate on, isolate from other selections so that you can be specific about what you're doing to that. That's kind of the name of the game as you get into some higher level work in Illustrator. Okay.
Can you show us how to actually paint something like that?
Yes, that's what I'm going to do next. So, sorry, it took me a little bit to get there. So we have the live paint bucket that we made the selection of earlier. Just for the point of right now, I'm going to keep that landscape layer on. So now I'm going to go over to live paint bucket selection again. So we have our bucket tool, and notice the empty sets that are above it. Everything is just a null set basically right now. If I were to change the fill over here in the color box menu to, if I double click this, I can choose any color I want. Let's say I want to make it, just again to further the point here, let's say it's a kind of a reddish pink color. We'll click OK. So now that pink color is in the color selector, and it's also now highlighted as my live paint color of choice. So now, right now, outside of my color live paint selection, it still has that little negative box because there's no selection that it's hovering over. As soon as I go over aspects of the scene, it's saying, all right, you can paint this as you want to. So as soon as I left click, I can start to add color to these things. I'm just left clicking. As soon as it gives me a box that highlights, I can also hold down the left click as I through highlighted boxes, and I can select multiple highlighted boxes, and it will color those in. I could also, if I decided I wanted to, say I wanted everything that's on this live paint bucket layer to be the same color. So I could triple click 1, 2, 3 very rapidly, and it will click every possible shape that it could fill in that scene. It will fill with the color of my choice. So then I can say I know that I want to go back and maybe change the streetscape to something else. I can, while I'm not in my selection, I can go over to the either none, or I can choose another color and have that. We'll click that back to none again, and now notice the live paint now is nothing. So I can go back here and I can click just in, say, the streetscape layer and remove the color from that area. This also works with, let's see, this also works with hatches. So if I go over to my swatches menu, yeah, question?
Can you do the command when you made it all?
Mm-hmm. So basically what it will do is every possible object in the live paint that I created, if I triple click the left mouse button while I have my color selected, it should allow me to just fill every possible thing. So I have to be in live paint, I'm hovering over the area that I want to change, and then I just click kind of very, very quickly, 1, 2, 3, and it should fill it all in. It might actually even be a double click for the sake of the full. Yeah. Is that not working for everybody?
When I did the paint bucket tool, I did not select the outline.
Okay.
The frame, so maybe that's...
You don't need to select, so you actually don't want to be selecting like the specific geometry edge. You want to be selecting inside of, it'll want to be glowing,
Okay.
right? So let's say I wanted to change everything in the scene now to a different color, to green, say. So anywhere in the scene that's highlighted, right? I can triple click actually. It should let me. So that's it. It's a little bit finicky. Basically, if I have other colors that I've added into the scene, it's going to be even more specific about if I wanted to change everything. So I believe it will work with that triple click. If we go back to the red, I hover over this box here, and I make sure that I've clicked it 3 times. It changes everything.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay.
But not the whole picture, like you have the whole thing in magenta. It's not, I don't have the whole frame, interior of the frame color.
Did so what did it just change the color of the one object that you had?
All the frames of the buildings, not the whole
Okay.
picture.
So another thing, so there's a couple layers to this. I guess it is, if you double click, it will fill in everything that's touching, basically. Should fill in everything that's touching. If you triple click, it'll fill in everything in the selection. So there's a couple, again, I think, test that out. Question, Nick?
Both. Well, I'm talking about this whole page. Where the whole thing has magenta. How did he do that?
So for us, there's some blocks that's not complete, the lines are complete.
Oh, because the frame is too light?
The frame is close enough.
Closed here, got it. But I
So
think
if
that's what he said the frame was doing for us.
So the frame should, if you've made your paint selection correctly, that frame should be part of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to fill these colors in at all.
Could you maybe do that step one more time?
Yeah.
Where you got to close the borders there?
Yeah, absolutely. Here, we'll just do undo. Everybody kind of conceptually understands what this tool does, though. All right, it fills in colors. Not that complicated, I guess, but very powerful. So, okay, so I'm back to, I just did Control-Z until I got back to my frame being on its own layer. Okay. This is also a good opportunity to probably just say, for the sake of organization, you should make a separate layer for your live paint work so that it doesn't get confusing. But we'll just do it the same way we did it before for now.
So just do another layer and call it live paint?
For right now, I think it's going to get too confusing, so let's just have it be building outline and frame like we had. So I want to make sure that I have everything selected, right?
Right.
And right now it shows that I have my frame color is the color of the layer that I have, right? So I know that that's on one layer, and I know that this is on a different layer. It's on red. And also, it's just showing, because I'm using the V selection tool, it is showing that the extent of the shapes here actually is bounded by the selection box, but it's not actually saying that there's lines there. When I specifically select that, it's a little deceptive with the black selection tool versus white. Like if I were to select all these, turn that off, it basically, the V selection tool will draw a larger bounding box around the extent of the selection. So as soon as you add something else, as soon as I add this other shape, that bounding box gets bigger. So in this particular case, it just happens to be overlapping an actual shape. That's that same size. Okay, so I have everything selected. Then I go to my live paint, click live paint, highlights everything, and it has moved that frame layer up to the building outline, right? Which again, for right now is okay. So now if we go into, you'll also notice that the color picker does a good job of remembering what you had just previously used, or the last few things that you were looking at. So it knows that I was using that red color, so I could actually just, from that quick menu, pull that up. I could also, there's color guide menus and other swatch menus that we can go into later that you can pick colors from. But let's use that red again. We'll go back to live paint. So if I click it once, right? Just discretely. I'm just filling in each area that's a highlighted box. That's fine. I'm just going to undo that real quick so we get back to the beginning of it. I could also drag, click, and then while I'm holding down my left clicker, just drag over all the shapes that I want to highlight and fill in, and then let go of the left clicker, and it will fill in everything that I selected in that way. That's another way to do it. Or if I knew that I wanted everything to be one color, I should be able to, while the scene is unadorned by other colors, triple click, and it'll fill everything in. So if we notice there, if I double click here, so what that did is it, just like our isolation, yeah, that's a better way to describe it, I guess. Just like our isolation of the live paint group, where it let me go into like a sub-layer of the line work, and I could just be working on that kind of in isolation. The double click basically unlocks like one other layer of adjacency in the live paint group. So like one click just fills in the exact shape that I had. A second click, I believe, will fill in the next layer of like adjacent boxes. So let's undo that again so it's all clear. If I double click, it's filled in a little bit haphazardly. It's filled in objects kind of willy-nilly. Like I'm actually, I need to go back, and it looks like it might be everything that wasn't a discretely closed shape. So everything that shared that frame outline looks like it was able to be filled in as a secondary object, if you can see there. So if we go back, these objects that are completely within the frame, that are their own shapes, when I double click, it doesn't fill those ones in. It's still saying, all right, those are the last layer of their own thing. That's three umbrellas down from when I started the live paint command. So when I triple click, I've like passed through each of those doors basically. So it's the single object with a single click. It is, I guess, the object that you're clicking on plus any object that has possibly an open edge or a slightly different attribute. And then the last one is the kind of the purely discrete closed shapes. So the triple click should allow you to fill it in completely. So notice there too, like if I had filled this in partway, and then I go back in and I wanted to fill everything in a color, but I triple click on the red part, it's actually confused. It doesn't understand. It's not filling in new information because that's already been made the color that I want it. So I'd have to go into an as yet filled in color and do the triple click to get everything else to go, right? So now if I triple click here, it fills in everything. A little bit weird in terms of the sequence of how you individually click something versus the global click. But again, I think the idea of being able to very quickly fill in information, go back and pull out the fact that we just want to highlight our buildings, and let's say that this is a little bit more conventional here. Let's say this is a dark gray. And notice there, when I triple clicked, it changed everything that was already just red. So everything in the scene I'll go back and do it again. So because I had just made this portion of the live paint clear, now when I go back to change the color of all the red boxes, when I triple click, it actually just does it for it has learned kind of what I'm trying to do. So it's saying, okay, you're trying to change just these shapes to another color by triple clicking. So it lets you filter it that way. It's kind of nice. That might be a little bit dark for us to see our line weight. So let's test out a couple let's just go make this a little bit lighter. We'll triple click again to change everything. And then now if I go back and I turn on some of my other layers, just starting to get, the detail is just a little bit nicer. You're starting to see, you can still see the line weight from the details layer. Our gray still might be a little bit dark. What time is it, by the way? I'm going to move on here in a minute. The gray might be a little bit dark, but you get the idea. So we could also go in and say that we wanted to now make all the trees their own live paint. We can turn off the building outlines. We could turn off everything but landscape. And in this case, this is where you're going to run into a problem on the edges, right? Because those trees also needed that boundary frame. So you can create a new frame for the sake of the geometry here. We could draw a shape and fit it kind of to the boundary of the scene that we have. So I've just drawn. Let's make this an empty shape so that we can see inside. But I could toggle just by dragging the control points on the edges. I could pull this in until it lines up with like the extent of the geometry that I know needs to be closed. Question? Yes.
I might be able to just copy the original frames you made, right?
You absolutely can do that. Yeah. So there's a couple ways. There's a couple ways, obviously, to do it. So in this case, what I was going to do here was actually just make a shape that kind of fit this particular geometry, and then we were going to make this invisible, so that this was its own kind of separate object. But that's a good observation, and that's probably the cleaner way to do it. You could just go back into our building outline situation, have this copied, and then Control C, and you can either do Control V or Control Alt V to copy in place. What you're going to notice here is by trying to select with the direct selection tool, just like we did earlier, it's only copying that one line rather than the whole thing. So you'd have to be a little bit more, I think you'd have to go into the selection, select it with your V, type Control C, exit back out, it's a little bit convoluted, and then you could type Control V and then you'd be able to get that shape. And then you could move that shape into place or copy it in place like we just said and move it to its own layer again if you wanted to, so that you haven't lost that information. In this particular case, looks like we've been able to realign that okay. So there's our remade frame, and we can make this invisible. In this case, do our live paint again. So now everything within the tree shapes are able to be filled. And in this particular case, what I want to actually do is I want to go into my swatch menu, which is the little colored boxes. And within the swatch libraries menu, there's a whole sequence of submenus that have arranged colors in different ways. We've organized, there's also hatch patterns and line work patterns. So if we go down to patterns, go to basic graphics, and there's a dots, a lines, and a textures layer. So let's pull up the basic graphics textures. So within that, there's a series of hatches, basically, similar to what's in CAD. We can make our previews of these a little bit bigger if we wanted to. We could say in the pull-down menu on the upper right, you can make the thumbnail view larger if you needed to, so you can see what these look like. So within that, let's say that we want our tree hatch to be a little bit abstract. Let's say it is a series of crosses. So I can pull up this cross hatch. You can see it becomes the color, basically, in the color picker, the fill menu. Then I go back to my live paint, and I zoom in on my trees and start to fill that in. I can fill in these various things, similar to how I would hatch something in CAD, right? So it's keeping that hatch across multiple things. I could decide that I wanted to triple click to fill it all in, and then go back and just clean it up a little bit, just show where the tree selections are. So once I've done that, if I could change the scale of this. Obviously, when there's a color fill, there's no scale attached to it, but say that this was reading a little bit too, like these crosses felt a little bit too big. We could click on the hatch pattern. And again, with the direct selection tool, or with the selection tool rather, the V selection, it's selecting the entirety of the live paint. I go up to Object and Transform, and I could go to Scale. And within Scale, I can either transform objects in the scene. If I were to, the default would be that. So if I were to change this to 200%, it's actually just going to make everything bigger if I preview, right? I don't want to do that. I actually want to keep the object the same size. I just want to change the fill. So unclick transform objects and say transform patterns. Now it's just going to mess with the fill, but it's going to keep the boundary of the fill the same. So I could change this to 500% and preview, and it changes the size of the crosses. I could change this to, let's make it a little bit smaller, 50%, say. And so now that density of crosses is larger or smaller. You can also just use your mouse scroll to go up and down on the scale to kind of get a visual reference point for what you want. Or again, directly input it if you need to. So we could click OK, now that we've seen our preview there. And you can easily change those hatches after they have, you're not locked into it by whatever scale it was in CAD. So again, kind of turning back on some of our layer information. You're just starting to get a slightly more, robust drawing. Some of the color, some of the line work, some of the textures that are going with it. We could go in and highlight the pavilion in a different way. Maybe that becomes red line work. So selected all of that line work, could make it red. And actually, you might encounter in this case sometimes if you're working in black and white and you attempt to change the color of something that's gray or black, it grayscales it rather than changing it to the color that you wanted. A simple override for that is you can go to your swatch menu and simply open up any submenu that has colors preset in it and just basically override the grayscale by selecting a color. And then it will change that color, and then you can go in and change it to whatever you want. So we could also make a live paint out of this if we wanted to. We could draw a new shape around this to highlight that the perimeter of this is a little bit thicker than the rest of the line work in the scene. Say we wanted to create a layer called diagram outline. I'm going to move this to the top of my sequence here. And I'm actually going to lock this pavilion layer so that I don't accidentally mess with the line work here. But in the diagram outline layer then, say I wanted to make a much thicker shape around this to highlight the extent of it. I could use my pen tool to draw a thicker shape. Let's say I want to go over to stroke. I could say 2.5. That's going to be pretty damn thick, but let's give it a try. So with my pen tool turned on, red as the stroke color, 2.5 as the stroke weight, I can click around, making sure that my base layer is locked. I can click around and just like drawing a polyline in CAD or in RHINO, I can just use the control points that are on the basic shape to just left click at each new point to create kind of a highlight boundary around this. And then I can click back at the original anchor to close the shape. Just so you get kind of a little bit more subtlety to kind of the highlight in the scene. So there's kind of a quick highlight of that. You could, because it's a closed shape, we could, because it's not a collection of objects that we want to change color, we could just change the fill of this to a color if we wanted to. We could change it to pink. If we wanted the line work that's below it to show through, let's say we change this to pink, it fills out everything above it because that layer is above everything else, right? So that line work reads above everything else. I actually still want to see that line weight, but I want to have that read as have it read all as pink. So I could go over to my appearance menu, and within that you can adjust the fill of the opacity of the object. So if we go into fill, we go into opacity. You can see you can change the opacity of the shape here by, we click 50%. It actually is letting me just change the opacity of the fill to something lighter. I could also, there's a series of filters here. Say I wanted to keep it at the darkness that I had it and not lighten that up at all, but have the line work read through. There's a filter within the opacity menu called multiply. which just lets the line work that's below it shine through. So it lets color get attached. It's a little bit simpler than, say, the live paint group, where we would have had to make, that whole set of objects, into the live paint group, and then individually add color to them, and then they're less editable. In this case, I've just made an object that has a fill that has a transparency filter on it, so that object is its own. If I move it around the scene, it's basically just a colored window that I can edit independently of the other line work. So again, a general sense of kind of some of the basics of Illustrator to make the drawing pop a little bit more. The live paint tool is really useful. You could start to, we're going to run out of time here, I think, but okay, actually we have a few more minutes. So the live paint tool obviously is useful, but as we saw, it constricts your layers in a way. So just be mindful of the order of operations that you're deploying that. You can create a series of discrete objects that have their own fills or their own hatches. If we went back to our hatch menu, I could apply a hatch, to the interior of that. Mess with the scale of it differently from the other tree hatches. I could pull up my patterns menu and do something else entirely. Let's see, textures. It's a grass texture or a dot texture. I mean, I would encourage you guys to go through and check out some of these different textures. They're all useful in their own way to again give legibility to the drawing. It's funny, if you go back now, if we were to go back now and look at the PDF that we were looking at earlier of the different maps, let's see if I can pull that up. We zoom in on some of the stuff that's going on here. You can see that a good amount of this work was likely done in Illustrator. Of course, it was CAD or RHINO as well, but a lot of this is just a simple combination of layer management, fills, hatches here and there to give some legibility to some of these areas. The same goes in general for some of the ways that these maps are reading. It's just a simple compilation of shapes that build up to a more complex drawing. So one other thing I want to do in Illustrator here, and we're going to be out of time, I think, is let's say we wanted to add some arrows or some line work that was implying dynamism or some sort of critical analysis to the drawing itself. Actually, I want to do two things here. I want to very quickly import the other drawings into this drawing so that we can work on them all at the same time. I should have done that at the beginning, but I'll show you guys now. If you go to Document Setup, basically what this shows is you can have multiple artboards in one Illustrator file. It can get heavy, so you want to be mindful of that, but it's a useful way to make sure that your graphics across multiple drawings are consistent. So let's say
Document setup? I don't have that on my screen.
on the top. Okay, so if you go to, let's see.
Oh, you're gonna deselect.
Yeah, if you deselect the object that you're in, it should come up at the top. Yep, exactly. All right, so we're in a document setup menu. I want to click Edit Artboards, and then what that actually does is it highlights the one artboard that I had in the scene. If I were to, let's go over to my Layers menu and just lock all the layer. Actually, I'll show it two ways. Let's unlock everything. Now I'm going to, you can see the directional arrows here as I hover over this. If I hold down Alt and I left click drag, I can copy this whole layout over. If I release, it lets me basically make a carbon copy of that object. It keeps all the layers intact, all the line work, everything is identical. Say though I wanted to just make a new layout but not copy the line work over. Intuitively enough, you can just lock all the line work. We can go to Document Setup, Edit Artboards. I'm holding Alt, and then to keep it, I don't want it to move around, I want it to just be orthogonal. I can hold down Shift as I'm doing that to give it a lock. And then when I release everything, it creates a blank artboard for me. And I could do that a couple times. Let's say I'm going to make 3 artboards here. So I have 1, 2, 3. Was everybody able to follow that workflow? Okay. So now I'm going to go into, I'm going to click Control O for open, and I'm just going to open up my other two site plans real quick. Site plan 1 to 1250, and then I'm going to open up site plan 1 to 500. And then what I want to do, because these were all done on the same orientation drawing from CAD in the same viewport, even though they're at different scales, I have a registration point that allows me to copy these into my base file, and then have all these layouts kind of in conjunction in the same scene. So I'm going to select all in my 1 to 500. No need to pay attention to the layer right now. It's all in one layer, as we know. Now I'm going to click Control C. I'm going to go back to my site plan 1 to 2500, and I want to click on, in this case, because it's the 1 to 500, I'm going to have that be over here. I need to be able to have a layer that's unlocked for it to copy information into, or else it's going to give me this pencil with a that negative sign. So let's say, let's make a new layer that's just called import. So with that layer clicked and unlocked, and also with, you'll notice a slightly darkened box around this layout. It means that that layout is that artboard is the active artboard. If I were to just simply left click on this one, it should make that one the active one, or if I click on this one, the same goes. So what that means is that if I were to now paste information into this scene, it's going to try to paste it into that active artboard. So I want to go to I want to make sure that I have my far right artboard clicked. Now I'm going to click hold down Control Shift and click V. And then it's copied in exactly from the other file, my 1 to 500 information onto that layout.
You said Control Alt V?
Control Shift. Hold down Control Shift and then click V, just from the order of operations for how it will understand it. If you hold those first two buttons down, it'll help. And then the same thing we can do for our 1 to 1250. We'll go back into that file, select everything, copy it over. Make sure this artboard's active. Control Shift V. So now we have all of our line work and all of our drawings, even though they were exported as separate objects, in one master file. And I can look at these rather than flipping through pages, in sequence. I can see these all kind of in relation to one another. I could start to, obviously in our case here, our layer management was a little bit clunky as we came in, and that's something that we'll want to be a little bit more mindful of at the beginning of whatever drawing exercise you're going to do. If you know you're going to do 2 or 3 drawings, and you want to use a single workspace for it in Illustrator, I would bring all of the drawings in like we just did, then start to apply some of the layer organization, because what you're able to do here, right, is I can select this line weight if I want. If this was the way that I was organizing these layers, I could select this line weight. Let's make sure these are all unlocked. Select same appearance, and then it's selecting everything across the entire scene, and then it lets me move that to whatever I want. So I can move it to building outlines, toggle that on or off. So now all the building outline lines across the layers, across the artboards rather, are on the same line, are on the same layer. So I can pretty quickly kind of organize a composition of drawings again, to make the kind of the graphic legibility and consistency across everything a little bit cleaner. So that's one thing that's very useful that I would recommend you guys give a try. And then the last thing we'll show, I think, is just some quick line creation. The pen tool is useful for this. You could draw lines in CAD or in RHINO that represent, say, some sort of diagrammatic line of flow, traffic flow, or maybe how to get to the site through the streets or something like that. Or you can draw it in Illustrator itself. So let's say that we want to draw a line that goes down the boulevard and then kind of weaves through the trees to get to our building. I'm going to make a new layer just called diagram line. That'll lock these other layers. We'll be on diagram line, and let's make a red arrow. And there, again, we have our swatch color problem. So let's go up to our swatches menu. Just choose any default so we can get our color override. And we can make this whatever color we want. So we'll make it red. So I have my pen tool clicked. So I can draw with my pen tool. And again, just because this is a diagrammatic overlay, you're a little bit freer to kind of curate or be looser with how you're drawing the arrow. It doesn't have to be completely accurate, but let's say we want to draw, again, this kind of flow line. So I'll start here, click once. Maybe we click down here to start to extend the line. Another thing that I can do with my pen tool, which is really nice, I'm going to undo that second point I drew. When I click my second point, before I let go of my left click, I can drag the second point to add a grip to it that allows the line to be a curve rather than a line. And so what's nice about this, let's say I wanted to, again, just give the line an implication of a little bit more flow. So I've clicked that toggle. The next time I click here, it's basically extrapolating a slightly cleaner connection to that line, but it's curved it. So I could continue to kind of use my toggle to find my way through the trees and get to the building, right? I could go back. I could smooth this line out by either using my direct selection tool. While this is clicked, I can move any of these control points around. I could adjust any of these toggle lines so that they're a little bit softer. See that there? I could also I could delete lines I could delete points if I wanted to. If I wanted this to read a little less herky-jerky, I could left click with my direct selection tool, the point itself, and then just click delete. Oops, that actually removes it. Would have to go into my submenu and say delete anchor point. So the little minus sign, and then I could delete that point. And then it just keeps the line, but it's removed that one point. So different ways that you can edit these lines. I then could add, if I wanted to, I could add arrowheads to these. I could, again, we can change the line weights. Let's say it's a 2-point line or a 3-point line to really emphasize the kind of the diagrammatic nature of it. Let's say I wanted to make it a dotted line. If you're ever missing the sub-menu options, you can always go over to the More Options arrow here, Show Options, and then it will bring up the other stuff that we were looking at earlier, dashed line, etc. So I'm going to say, let's say this is a 3-point dotted line. Let's say that I don't want each of these little cells to read as a rounded corner, so I change the cap to straight, just so that it reads a little bit more cleanly. And so then let's say I also want to add some arrowheads to this. So I could go into my arrowheads menu, which is also in stroke. And I have a sequence of arrows that you can choose from. You can also custom make your own arrows. I would, for the sake of the chaos of your world right now, I would just pick from the pre-selected menu. They have some good ones. You could have, if we wanted to, we could imply kind of a start and an end to this. Maybe this is coming from one point, and then we were trying to imply that we wanted to get to this point. We could say that the beginning of our line is, a dot. We can also change the scale of the dot by messing around with this. I could change it to 50. I could change it to 500. So let's say that works. So now let's say I wanted to add an arrowhead to the other side. That's simply this other one here. So let's choose maybe this arrow. Arrow 11, I like that one. And again, we can change the arrowhead size if we wanted to, make it bigger or smaller. And then say you realize, oh, you know what, I want to flip the endpoints. I could just click this button and it flips the direction. So that's the end and that's the beginning now. So you can also link the scales if you wanted to make sure that things were consistent. Say you had two arrowheads that were the same, arrowhead number 11. Right now, this one's at 50%, this one's at 100. I could just click link, and these should come together. And they're not cooperating. But the idea is that you should be able to kind of gain consistency with that. So yeah, that's kind of some basics of some line work. some layer management, some of the color fills and diagram tools that you can use in Illustrator. The hatches and fills and the swatches menu are really fun to kind of dig into. Again, like there's many of these are just complementary colors. Some are, you know, like Pantone color books here. You could pull up the CMYK book, and there's every possible color that you could pick from, pretty much. Again, in case you needed consistency across files, being able to use the swatches keeps you from, all right, for this file I have this colored arrow, for this file I have this colored arrow, and it's just kind of lazy to do it that way. So if you find a sequence of colors that you like, when you add a color from the swatch menu, it should add it to your little swatches. And then you can quickly go back. Let's say I added, you know, yellow, blue, black, fine. With my swatches menu open, I can quickly create a sequence of shapes that I know will be the same color, or I can quickly change the color of them. So also be mindful of the stroke versus the fill. So the outline here is stroke. So what it's actually doing is it's making the outline yellow. You can toggle, you can flip these so that it just inverts them when I've selected it. Or you can, you know, if you didn't want to have a stroke on this, it was just the fill, you could remove that altogether by doing that. So no outline anymore. Also baseline, default fill and stroke. Say I have this object selected and I just want it to be a black and white box. I just click this button here, and it will change it to a white fill with I think a 1-point black line stroke. So a lot of different ways that you can toggle colors, line weights, and again create some kind of drawing consistency and legibility across multiple files. I think we'll stop there for now.